The clock on the dashboard read 6:47 p.m. as David Johnson turned onto Maple Street. After another long day at the office, all he wanted was to get home to his family. The black BMW hummed quietly as he drove through the tree-lined neighborhood where he'd lived for the past 8 years. Kids were playing on front lawns while parents watched from porches. It was the kind of peaceful evening scene that made him grateful for the life he'd built. David had just passed the elementary school when he noticed the police car in his rearview mirror. At first, he didn't think much of it. Police patrolled this area regularly, and he'd seen this particular cruiser before. But when the red and blue lights suddenly flashed on, his heart sank. He pulled over to the curb, his hands already moving to the steering wheel in the position he'd been taught since he was a teenager. Officer Thompson stepped out of his patrol car with the kind of swagger that immediately put David on edge. The officer was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. As he approached the driver's side window, David could see the man's eyes scanning the interior of the car with obvious suspicion. "License and registration," Thompson demanded without any greeting or explanation for the stop. His tone was sharp and unfriendly, completely different from how David had seen him interact with other drivers in the neighborhood. "Good evening, officer," David replied calmly, keeping his hands visible as he reached for his wallet. "May I ask what the reason for the stop is?" Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Just get your documents. We'll talk about that in a minute." David handed over his license and registration, noticing how the officer barely glanced at them before looking back at him with clear hostility. The license clearly showed his address on this very street, but Thompson seemed more interested in studying David's face than the information in front of him. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Thompson asked, his hand resting on his belt in a way that made David uncomfortable. The question caught David off guard. "I live here, officer. My address is right there on my license." Thompson looked at the license again, but his expression didn't change. "Yeah, I see that. But what are you really doing here? This isn't exactly your kind of area." The words hit David like a physical blow. After all these years, after everything he'd accomplished, he was still being judged by the color of his skin. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. Getting angry would only make things worse. "This is my neighborhood, officer. I've lived on Oak Ridge Drive for 8 years. My house is just 3 blocks from here." "Oak Ridge Drive, huh?" Thompson's voice dripped with disbelief. "That's a pretty expensive street. What do you do for work?" "I'm an attorney," David answered simply. Thompson actually laughed, and the sound was cruel and mocking. "Right, and I'm the president. Look, pal, I've been working this beat for 5 years. I know who belongs here and who doesn't. So why don't you tell me what you're really doing? Are you here to buy drugs? Steal something? Case houses for a break-in?" David felt his jaw clench despite his efforts to remain calm. "Officer, I'm telling you the truth. I work downtown and I was driving home from my office. I live in this neighborhood with my wife and 2 children. "Sure you do." Thompson stepped back and spoke into his radio. "Unit 47 requesting backup at Maple and 3rd. I've got a suspicious individual here." The word suspicious stung. David knew exactly what that meant in this context. He wasn't suspicious because of anything he'd done. He was suspicious because he was a black man driving an expensive car through a predominantly white neighborhood. Never mind that it was his own neighborhood. Never mind that he'd earned everything he had through years of hard work and dedication. A small crowd was beginning to gather on the sidewalk. David could see neighbors peering out from their windows and stopping their evening walks to watch the scene unfold. Some faces looked concerned, others merely curious. He recognized Mrs. Chen from down the street, but she didn't seem to recognize him from this distance. "Step out of the vehicle," Thompson ordered. "Am I under arrest?" David asked, knowing his rights. "Just step out of the car. Now." David complied, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. He was acutely aware of how this must look to the gathering crowd. Here he was, a respected member of the community, being treated like a criminal on his own street. Thompson began walking around the car, peering through the windows as if expecting to find evidence of some crime. "Nice car," he said with heavy sarcasm. "Must have cost a lot. Where'd you get the money for something like this?" "I bought it with money I earned from my job," David replied evenly. "What kind of lawyer are you supposed to be? Public defender? Legal aid?" The officer's tone suggested these were somehow lesser positions. "I work in the district attorney's office," David said quietly. Thompson stopped his inspection. of the car and stared at David with open mockery. The DA's office? Right. And what do you do there? Empty trash cans? Mop floors? The insults were becoming harder to bear, but David knew that losing his temper would only escalate the situation. He could see more neighbors gathering, and at least 2 people had their phones out, clearly recording the interaction. Part of him was grateful for the witnesses, but another part was embarrassed that his children's friends might see this video later. A second police car arrived, and Officer Martinez stepped out. David had seen Martinez around the neighborhood before, and had always found him to be professional and courteous. Maybe this situation would improve now. What's going on here, Thompson? Martinez asked as he approached. Found this guy driving around the neighborhood. Claims he lives here, but you know how that goes. Says he's a lawyer too. Thompson's tone made it clear what he thought of both claims. Martinez looked at David with a more neutral expression. Sir, can you tell me where you live? 1247 Oak Ridge Drive, David answered immediately. The blue house with the white shutters. My wife planted those rose bushes out front last spring. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. Oak Ridge Drive was indeed one of the most expensive streets in the area, lined with beautiful homes that most people could only dream of affording. But he'd seen stranger things in his career. Thompson wasn't ready to give up his suspicions. He says he works at the DA's office. Has a lawyer. He said the last words with particular emphasis, as if the very idea was ridiculous. The gathering crowd was getting larger, and David could hear whispers and murmurs from the sidewalk. He recognized more faces now. The Johnsons from 2 streets over. Mr. Peterson, who always waved when they passed each other during morning jogs, and several other neighbors he'd seen at community meetings and school events. This was supposed to be his sanctuary, his safe place where his children could grow up, without facing the kind of prejudice he'd experienced in his own childhood. Yet here he was, standing on the side of the road, being treated like a criminal while his neighbors watched. The irony wasn't lost on him that tomorrow morning, he might very well be prosecuting cases involving the very officer who was harassing him tonight. The tension in the air grew thicker as more neighbors gathered on the sidewalk. David could feel dozens of eyes watching his every move. Some faces showed concern, others curiosity, and a few displayed the uncomfortable expression of people witnessing something they knew was wrong, but didn't know how to stop. Officer Thompson seemed to feed off the attention. He puffed out his chest and spoke louder, as if performing for the growing audience. So you claim you live on Oak Ridge Drive, he said, his voice carrying across the quiet street. That's interesting because I patrol this area every day and I've never seen you before. David kept his voice calm and steady. Officer, I leave for work at 7:30 every morning and usually return around this time. Maybe our schedules don't cross paths very often. Right, Thompson said with another harsh laugh. 7:30 in the morning. What kind of drug dealer keeps banker's hours? The accusation hit David like a slap. Several people in the crowd gasped audibly. Mrs. Patterson, who lived just around the corner, stepped closer with a confused look on her face. She was starting to recognize David, but the context was so bizarre that she seemed unsure of herself. Officer, I'm not a drug dealer, David said firmly. I'm an attorney. I prosecute criminals for a living. Thompson's radio crackled and he stepped away to respond. While he spoke in hushed tones, Officer Martinez approached David with a more reasonable demeanor. Look, sir, I'm sorry about this situation, Martinez said quietly. If you really do live here, this should all be cleared up soon. Can you tell me anything else about your house? Details that would help verify your story? David appreciated the officer's more professional approach. My house has a red door and black mailbox with my family name on it. There's a tire swing in the backyard that I hung for my daughter last summer. My neighbor to the left has a golden retriever named Buddy who always barks when I come home. Martinez nodded, making mental notes. These weren't the kind of details someone would know unless they actually lived there. Thompson returned from his radio call, looking even more agitated. I just ran his name through the system, he announced loudly enough for the crowd to hear. David Johnson. No outstanding warrants, but that doesn't mean much. Could be using a fake ID. The suggestion that his identification was fraudulent was almost too much for David to bear. He'd worked his entire adult life to build his reputation and standing in the community. Now, in front of his neighbors, he was being treated like a common criminal. Officer Thompson, David said, his patience wearing thin despite his efforts to remain calm. I understand you're doing your job, but I've provided you with proper identification. I've answered all your questions. I haven't committed any crime. At what point does this stop? Thompson stepped closer, invading David's personal space in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. It stops when I say it stops. And right now, I'm not convinced you're being honest with me. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to search your vehicle for drugs and weapons. David's heart raced. He knew his rights, but he also knew that asserting them too forcefully could escalate the situation dangerously. Officer, I do not consent to a search of my vehicle. I haven't given you any reason to believe there's contraband in my car. I don't need your consent, Thompson replied with a smug grin. I have reasonable suspicion that you're engaged in criminal activity. Your nervous behavior, your presence in this neighborhood, and your evasive answers give me all the justification I need. The crowd was growing restless. Several people were now openly recording with their phones, and David could see the concern on many faces. A few neighbors were whispering among themselves, and he caught fragments of conversations about calling someone or whether they should intervene. Thompson began his search of the BMW, pulling items from the glove compartment and center console. He found David's business cards and examined them with obvious skepticism. Fancy cards, he muttered. You can get these made anywhere these days. He pulled out David's briefcase from the back seat and began rifling through legal documents. What's all this paperwork? He demanded. Those are case files from my work at the district attorney's office, David explained. Please be careful with them. They contain sensitive information. Thompson held up a folder and squinted at the official letterhead. For a moment, his confident demeanor seemed to waver slightly, but he quickly recovered. Could be fake, he said, though his voice lacked the same conviction as before. Mr. Peterson, who had been watching from across the street, finally worked up the courage to approach. He was an elderly man who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years and knew everyone. Excuse me, officer, he said politely. I think there might be some confusion here. This is David Johnson. He lives on Oak Ridge Drive with his wife Rebecca and their 2 children. They've been wonderful neighbors for years. Thompson whirled around to face the elderly man. Sir, I'm going to need you to step back. This is police business. But Mr. Peterson's words had an immediate effect on the crowd. Several other neighbors began murmuring agreement, and David could see recognition dawning on more faces. Mrs. Patterson pulled out her phone and began scrolling through what looked like neighborhood group chat messages. That's right, said another voice from the crowd. He helps organize the annual block party every summer. His daughter Sophie goes to school with my granddaughter. Thompson's face was growing red with frustration or embarrassment. I don't care what you people think you know, he shouted. This man was driving suspiciously through your neighborhood. He could be casing houses for burglaries. He could be here to deal drugs to your children. The accusations were becoming more desperate and far-fetched. David could see that even Officer Martinez was looking uncomfortable with his partner's behavior. A teenage boy in the crowd suddenly spoke up.
Hey, isn't that Sophie's dad?
He came to career day at our school last year and talked about being a prosecutor. The recognition spread through the gathering like wildfire. More neighbors began calling out confirmations of David's identity and his role in the community. Someone mentioned seeing his wife at the grocery store just last week. Another person talked about how David had helped organize the neighborhood watch program, but Thompson wasn't ready to back down. If anything, the community support seemed to make him more determined to prove his point. I don't care what anyone says, he declared. Until I'm satisfied that this man isn't a threat to this community, he's staying right here. David could see his house from where they stood. The porch light was on, and he knew Rebecca would be wondering where he was. She'd probably started dinner already, and the kids would be asking when Daddy was coming home. The thought of his family waiting for him, unaware that he was being humiliated just blocks away, filled him with a mixture of sadness and anger. Officer Martinez approached Thompson and spoke quietly, but David could make out some of the conversation. Martinez was clearly trying to convince his partner that they had enough information to verify David's identity and residence, but Thompson seemed determined to continue his investigation, convinced that he was on the verge of uncovering some major criminal conspiracy. The situation was spiraling into something much bigger than a simple traffic stop. David realized that this moment would be remembered by everyone present for years to come. The question was whether it would be remembered as an example of how racial prejudice could blind someone to obvious truth, or as something even worse, The evening air was filled with tension as the crowd of neighbors continued to grow. What had started as a few curious onlookers had turned into a significant gathering of community members, most of whom were now openly supporting David and vouching for his identity. The scene was becoming increasingly surreal. Mrs. Chen, who had initially watched from a distance, finally pushed through the crowd and approached the officers directly. She was a small woman, but her voice carried the authority of someone who had taught high school for 30 years before retiring. "Officers, I need to speak with you," she said firmly. "I've lived on this street for 22 years, and I'm telling you that this man is David Johnson. His family lives in the blue house on Oak Ridge Drive. I've watched his children grow up. His daughter Sophie helped me carry groceries just last month when I hurt my back." Thompson turned to face her with barely concealed irritation. "Ma'am, I appreciate your input, but I need to conduct my investigation without interference from civilians." "This isn't interference," Mrs. Chen replied coolly. "This is your neighbors trying to prevent you from making a serious mistake." Officer Martinez pulled out his radio and spoke quietly into it, requesting information about the resident at 1247 Oak Ridge Drive. Within moments, the dispatcher confirmed that the property was indeed registered to David and Rebecca Johnson, and that there were no outstanding complaints or issues associated with the address. David watched Martinez's face as he received this information. The younger officer's expression showed a mixture of relief and growing concern about his partner's behavior. He approached Thompson and whispered something that David couldn't hear, but Thompson's response was loud enough for everyone to catch. "I don't care what the records say," Thompson declared. "Records can be faked. People can assume false identities. I'm not satisfied that this man is who he claims to be." The statement drew audible gasps from several people in the crowd. David felt a deep weariness settle over him. No matter what evidence was presented, no matter how many neighbors vouched for him, Thompson seemed determined to maintain his suspicions. It was becoming clear that this wasn't really about verifying David's identity anymore. This was about something much deeper and more troubling. A new voice joined the conversation from the back of the crowd. "David, is that you?" Everyone turned to see a woman in jogging clothes pushing through the gathering. It was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who lived 2 blocks away and served on the school board with David's wife. She had clearly been out for her evening run when she noticed the commotion. "Oh my goodness, what's happening here?" she asked, looking genuinely shocked as she took in the scene. Thompson intercepted her before she could reach David. "Ma'am, please step back. This is a police investigation." Dr. Mitchell looked at him with confusion and growing anger. "Investigation of what?" "This is David Johnson. He's one of the most respected members of our community. He served on half the volunteer committees in this neighborhood." "So everyone keeps saying," Thompson replied sarcastically. "But I've got questions that need answers before I'm convinced." Dr. Mitchell's expression hardened. "Officer, I don't know what kind of questions you think you have, but I can tell you that you're interrogating a man who has done more for this community than most people do in a lifetime. He organized the legal clinic that helps seniors with estate planning. He coached Little League for 3 years. He's been a mentor to countless young people." The crowd murmured agreement with her words. David felt a mix of gratitude and embarrassment as his neighbors recounted his community involvement. He had never sought recognition for these activities, and certainly never imagined they would be used as evidence of his right to exist peacefully in his own neighborhood. Thompson's radio crackled again, and this time the dispatcher's voice was clearer. "Unit 47, be advised that we've received multiple calls about your location. Residents are reporting a disturbance involving an officer and a member of the community." The words seemed to hit Thompson like cold water. For the first time since the stop began, he looked uncertain. David could see the wheels turning in the officer's mind. He realized that his actions were being scrutinized not just by the immediate crowd, but by the broader community. Officer Martinez stepped forward, clearly trying to defuse the situation. "David, I apologize for the confusion tonight. We've verified your identity and residence. You're free to go home to your family." But Thompson wasn't ready to let it end there. "Hold on, Martinez. I'm the senior officer here, and I say when this stop is concluded." The crowd was growing restless. Several people were now actively recording the interaction, and David could see phones being held up throughout the gathering. He knew that videos of this encounter would likely be shared widely, and the thought filled him with dread. His children would probably see this eventually, His colleagues at work would see it. The entire community would witness his humiliation. A young father from down the street stepped forward with his toddler in his arms. "Officer Thompson, this is getting ridiculous. We all know David, our kids play together. He's been to my house for barbecues. This has gone way too far." Thompson's face was now flushed red with anger and what might have been embarrassment. "Everyone just needs to back off and let me do my job," he shouted. "I don't care how many people vouch for this guy. Something doesn't add up here." David finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "Officer Thompson, what exactly doesn't add up? You've seen my identification. You've verified my address. You've heard from dozens of my neighbors. You've searched my car and found nothing but legal documents and personal belongings. What more do you need?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone present seemed to be waiting for Thompson's answer, because they all knew what David was really asking. What more did he need beyond all this evidence? What was really driving his suspicions? Thompson opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, another police car pulled up to the scene. This one was different from the patrol cars already present. It was larger and had additional markings that indicated a supervisory vehicle. Sergeant Williams stepped out of the car and surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a 20-year veteran. He took in the crowd of neighbors, the two officers, and David standing beside his BMW, with his hands still positioned carefully where everyone could see them. "What's the situation here?" Sergeant Williams asked, his voice carrying the authority that comes with rank and experience. Thompson quickly launched into his version of events, describing a suspicious individual who claimed to live in the neighborhood but whose story he found questionable. But his explanation sounded weak and unconvincing when delivered in front of dozens of community members who were shaking their heads and murmuring disagreement. Sergeant Williams listened patiently, then turned to Officer Martinez for his assessment. Martinez's account was much more balanced, acknowledging that David's identity had been verified and that multiple neighbors had confirmed his residence and standing in the community. As the sergeant processed this information, David noticed him looking more carefully at the documents that had been removed from his car during the search. The sergeant picked up David's business cards and legal documents, examining them with the attention to detail that Thompson had lacked. Suddenly, Sergeant Williams's expression changed. He was reading something more carefully, and David could see recognition dawning on his face. The sergeant looked up at David with what appeared to be surprise, then back down at the documents, then back at David again. "Officer Thompson," the sergeant said slowly, "I need to speak with you privately, right now." Sergeant Williams pulled Officer Thompson aside, walking several steps away from the crowd and speaking in hushed but urgent tones. David couldn't hear the exact words being exchanged, but he could see Thompson's face changing from defiant confidence to confusion, and finally to what looked like horror. The crowd had grown quiet, sensing that something significant was happening. Even the children who had been playing nearby seemed to understand that this was a moment worth paying attention to. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the occasional crackle of police radios. David remained where he was, maintaining the same calm posture he'd held throughout the entire ordeal. But inside, his mind was racing. He had recognized the look on Sergeant Williams's face when the man had examined his business cards and legal documents. It was the same expression people got when they suddenly realized they were looking at something much more important than they had initially thought. Thompson's voice rose slightly, and fragments of his conversation with the sergeant became audible to those standing closest. "But Sergeant, I was just doing my job. How was I supposed to know? He never said—" Sergeant Williams cut him off sharply. "That's exactly the point, Thompson. He shouldn't have to say anything. Every citizen deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of who they are or what position they hold." Dr. Mitchell, who had been watching the exchange intently, leaned over to Mrs. Chen. "Something's changed," she whispered. "Look at the sergeant's face. He knows something we don't." The two officers continued their heated discussion for another minute before Sergeant Williams walked back toward David. His demeanor was completely different now, professional but also apologetic in a way that suggested this situation had taken on dimensions that went far beyond a simple traffic stop. "Mr. Johnson," the sergeant said, extending his hand in greeting, "I want to apologize on behalf of the department for this evening's events. There's been a serious misunderstanding here. David shook the offered hand, noting the formal tone and the respectful address. "Thank you, Sergeant." "I appreciate that." Thompson remained several feet away, looking like a man who had just received devastating news. Officer Martinez stood beside him, clearly confused about what information had been shared during the private conversation. Sergeant Williams cleared his throat and addressed the crowd. "Folks, I want to thank you all for your patience tonight. This situation should have been resolved much more quickly, and I apologize for the disruption to your evening." But the crowd wasn't satisfied with a generic apology. Mr. Peterson stepped forward, his elderly frame somehow managing to project indignation and authority at the same time. "Sergeant, what we witnessed here tonight wasn't just a disruption," he said firmly. "It was harassment of one of our most valued neighbors. David Johnson has lived in this community for years. He's contributed more to making this a better place than most of us combined. Yet your officer treated him like a criminal based on nothing more than assumptions." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. Several other neighbors nodded vigorously, and David could see people taking notes and pictures documenting everything for later reference. Sergeant Williams nodded gravely. "You're absolutely right, and I can assure you that this matter will be investigated thoroughly." Officer Thompson's conduct tonight fell far short of department standards. Thompson finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "Sergeant, I still don't understand what's happening here. You said there was something I needed to know about this man, but—" "Officer Thompson," Sergeant Williams interrupted, his voice carrying a warning tone, "I think it would be best if you returned to your vehicle and waited for further instructions." But David had had enough of the mystery and whispered conversations. He stepped forward, addressing both officers directly. "Gentlemen, I think it's time to clear the air completely," he said calmly. "Sergeant Williams, I can see that you've recognized my name from the documents in my car. Officer Thompson deserves to know who he's been questioning for the past hour." Thompson looked back and forth between David and his sergeant with growing confusion. "I don't understand what you're talking about." David reached into his jacket pocket slowly, making sure both officers could see his movements. He pulled out his official identification card and held it up where everyone could see it. "Officer Thompson, my name is David Johnson, and I am the district attorney for this county. I was appointed to this position 3 months ago, and I believe that makes me your boss." The words hit the crowd like a thunderbolt. Gasps and exclamations erupted from dozens of people simultaneously. Someone in the back of the crowd shouted, "Oh my God," while another person could be heard saying, "I can't believe this is happening." Thompson stared at the identification card as if it were written in a foreign language. His mouth opened and closed several times without any sound emerging. The color drained from his face completely, leaving him looking pale and sick. Officer Martinez stepped closer to get a better look at the ID, and his eyes widened when he confirmed what David had just announced. "Sir, we had no idea. If we had known—" "That's exactly the point," David replied calmly. "You shouldn't need to know who someone is before treating them with basic human dignity. Every person you encounter in your duties deserves respect, regardless of their job title or social status." The crowd was buzzing with excitement and disbelief. Mrs. Chen was explaining to someone next to her how she had always suspected David had an important job but had never known exactly what he did. Dr. Mitchell was shaking her head in amazement, while Mr. Peterson looked both vindicated and furious about what he had just witnessed. Thompson finally found his voice, and when he spoke, it was with the desperation of a man watching his career crumble before his eyes. "Mr. Johnson, why, sir? I mean, District Attorney Johnson. I was just doing my job. I didn't know who you were. If you had just told me from the beginning—" David held up a hand to stop him. "Officer Thompson, the problem isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is how you treated me once you decided I didn't belong here. You made assumptions based on my appearance and the color of my skin. You refused to believe multiple forms of identification. You ignored the testimony of dozens of community members. You treated me like a criminal without cause." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Everyone present understood the gravity of what had just been revealed. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity or overzealous policing. This was a district attorney being racially profiled by one of the officers who worked under his jurisdiction. Sergeant Williams stepped forward, clearly trying to manage a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. "Sir, I want to assure you that this matter will receive the highest priority investigation. Officer Thompson's actions tonight were completely inappropriate and will face serious consequences. Thompson looked as if he might collapse. The realization of what he had done, and more importantly, who he had done it to, was clearly overwhelming him. He had spent an hour publicly humiliating his own boss, recorded by dozens of witnesses based entirely on racial prejudice. David could see phones throughout the crowd, all pointed in their direction. He knew that within hours this entire encounter would be spreading across social media. The video of a white police officer racially profiling the black district attorney would likely go viral, bringing scrutiny not just to Thompson, but to the entire department. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Tomorrow morning, he would likely be reviewing cases that involved the very officer who had just spent an hour treating him like a criminal. The man who had questioned his right to exist in his own neighborhood would soon be hoping that same man would sign off on his arrest reports and prosecutorial recommendations. The silence that followed David's revelation was deafening. Even the children in the crowd seemed to understand that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Officer Thompson stood frozen in place, his face a mask of shock and dawning horror as the full implications of his actions began to sink in. David looked around at the faces surrounding him, his neighbors and community members who had rallied to his defense. He felt a deep sense of gratitude mixed with sadness. These people had known him for years, had seen his character and contributions to their shared community. Yet it had taken their collective testimony to convince a police officer that he deserved basic respect. "Officer Thompson," David said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air, "I want you to understand something important. This isn't about me being the district attorney. This isn't about my position or title giving me special treatment. This is about the fact that what happened here tonight happens to people every day. People who don't have titles or community support or cameras recording their encounters." Thompson managed to nod weakly, though his eyes remained fixed on the ground. Dr. Mitchell stepped forward from the crowd. "David, I'm so sorry this happened to you. This is absolutely unacceptable." "Thank you, Sarah," David replied, using her first name with the familiarity of someone who had worked alongside her on numerous community projects. "But I want everyone to understand that I don't want sympathy. I want this to be a learning moment for all of us." Sergeant Williams was speaking quietly into his radio, clearly coordinating with his supervisors about how to handle what had become a major incident. David could make out fragments of the conversation, including references to immediate investigation, media attention, and damage control. Mrs. Chen approached David with tears in her eyes. "We've all failed you tonight," she said softly. "We should have spoken up sooner. We should have intervened more forcefully." David shook his head gently. "You didn't fail me. You supported me when it mattered most. But I hope this helps everyone understand why we need to speak up every time we see injustice, not just when it happens to someone we know personally." The crowd began to slowly disperse as people processed what they had witnessed. But many lingered, clearly wanting to show their continued support for David and their disapproval of Thompson's actions. Several neighbors approached to apologize personally and to express their commitment to ensuring that nothing like this would happen again in their community. Officer Martinez, who had remained mostly quiet during the latter part of the encounter, finally spoke up. "Sir, I want to apologize for my role in this. I should have done more to de-escalate the situation." David studied the younger officer's face and saw genuine remorse. "Officer Martinez, I appreciate your apology, but I hope you'll remember this moment the next time you see a colleague making assumptions about someone based on their appearance. Good officers have a responsibility to speak up when they witness inappropriate behavior." Thompson finally found his voice again, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "District Attorney Johnson, I don't know what to say. I made a terrible mistake." David looked at the man who had spent the last hour humiliating him in front of his neighbors. He felt anger, certainly, but also something approaching pity. Thompson's career was likely over, and the video of this encounter would follow him for the rest of his life. "Officer Thompson, your mistake wasn't just about tonight," David said calmly. "Your mistake was the assumption that someone who looks like me doesn't belong in a neighborhood like this. Your mistake was refusing to listen when multiple people vouched for my character and standing in the community. Your mistake was treating me as guilty until proven innocent, rather than with the respect that every citizen deserves." Thompson nodded miserably. Yes, sir. You're right. I have no excuse for my behavior. Sergeant Williams concluded his radio conversation and returned to the group. Sir, my captain would like to speak with you personally as soon as possible. We take this matter extremely seriously. I appreciate that, Sergeant, David replied. But right now I just want to go home to my family. They're probably wondering where I am. As if summoned by his words, headlights appeared at the end of the street. David's wife Rebecca was driving toward them, having clearly come looking for her husband when he failed to return home at his usual time. She parked her car and stepped out, taking in the scene with obvious confusion and growing alarm. David, what's happening here? She called out as she approached. The crowd parted to let her through, and David could see the concern on her face as she noticed the police cars and the gathering of neighbors. He walked over to meet her, placing a gentle hand on her arm. I'm fine, honey, he said softly. There was a misunderstanding, but it's being resolved. Rebecca's eyes flicked from her husband to the officers to the crowd of neighbors, clearly trying to piece together what had transpired. Dr. Mitchell approached and quietly explained the situation, and David watched his wife's expression change from confusion to anger to disbelief. They did what? Rebecca's voice rose in indignation. David, this is outrageous. We have to do something about this. We will, David assured her, but right now I just want to go home. Sergeant Williams stepped forward with obvious reluctance. Sir, if you're willing, we'd appreciate the opportunity to discuss this matter further. Perhaps we could schedule a meeting tomorrow. David nodded. Of course, Sergeant. But I want to be clear about something. This isn't going to be handled quietly or swept under the rug. This community deserves to know that their police department is committed to treating everyone fairly, regardless of their race or background. Absolutely, sir. Full transparency. As David and Rebecca prepared to leave, several neighbors approached to offer their continued support. Mr. Peterson shook David's hand firmly. We're behind you 100%, the elderly man said. Whatever you need from this community, you have it. Mrs. Chen nodded in agreement. We've all learned something important tonight about the need to stand up for what's right. David looked back at Officer Thompson one last time. The man appeared completely defeated, staring at the ground with the posture of someone who knew his world had just collapsed around him. Officer Thompson, David said, drawing the man's attention, I hope you'll use this experience to become a better person and a better officer. If you can learn from this, then maybe something positive can come out of tonight. Thompson looked up with surprise, perhaps having expected only anger and retribution. Thank you, sir. I will. I promise. As David and Rebecca walked toward their cars, the crowd finally began to disperse in earnest. But the conversations continued in driveways and on front porches throughout the neighborhood. People were already talking about organizing community meetings, reaching out to other local officials, and ensuring that the police department implemented meaningful reforms. By the time David and Rebecca reached their driveway, they could see the warm light spilling from their windows and their children's silhouettes moving around inside. This was home, the sanctuary he had worked so hard to provide for his family. Tonight, that sanctuary had been violated by prejudice and ignorance, but it had also been defended by the community they had chosen to be part of. David knew that by tomorrow morning, video of the encounter would be spreading across social media platforms. The story of a district attorney being racially profiled in his own neighborhood would likely make national news. There would be interviews, investigations, and probably protests. His private family life would become public in ways he had never wanted. But as he looked at his house, thinking about his children inside doing homework or playing games, he realized that this moment could also be an opportunity to demonstrate that justice and dignity weren't reserved for people with titles and positions. An opportunity to show his community and his department that true leadership meant standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult or uncomfortable. The porch light cast a warm glow as David and Rebecca walked hand in hand toward their front door, ready to hold their children a little tighter and begin the important work of turning a moment of injustice into a catalyst for positive change.